Today I want to talk about the essence of what makes a great speech, and I want us to look at it through the framework of some ancient wisdom and examine how we see that wisdom applied by the great speakers of history, including the man you saw on the thumbnail. There's a phrase that comes to mind. It's a phrase as old as recorded history. Our first known instance of it was written in 500 BC, an Assyrian text about a chancellor 200 years before that who spoke that phrase. You already know what the phrase is. You've been hearing it your whole life. The pen, or in this case, the word, is mightier than the sword. For there are many things that people wouldn't cower from the sword over, but they could be persuaded about. 300 odd years before the birth of Jesus Christ, there was a young king of Macedonia, a man who conquered and would have kept conquering, probably all the way to the South China Sea, had he the means and the troops to do so. In India, many thousands of miles from home, his troops finally broke, not in defeat of battle, but they said no further. And this young man by the name of Alexander the Great, he acquiesced, and he and his army returned to their base in Babylon. There again his Macedonian troops became unsettled. They rebelled. They were angry that Alexander had brought so many of the Persians into the fold, a conquered people, the Greeks' age-old nemesis. Like scorned lovers, they turned on their king, not with violence, but with a planned desertion, in what was one of the most brilliant displays of oratory skill that we have on the historical record. Alexander got up and spoke to his troops on the eve of their departure. He began by enumerating all of the things that his father, King Philip, had done for these men, and then began to list all of the numerous peoples that he had conquered with them and for them. He spoke of their grand adventure, of conquering further than any Greek had gone in history, of how his Macedonian troops had enriched themselves every step of the way, that they had come from little and were now heirs to the earth, that those who had fallen in battle were now honoured with statues, with memorials, their families freed from taxation, but that none of the men before him had fallen in battle. Here they were with everything that they could dream of, and it wasn't enough. So he told them to go home, to Macedonia, and to be proud of deserting their king in this moment. But they didn't go. Alexander the Great shamed his rebelling Macedonian Greek troops into begging for his forgiveness. Such is the power of great oration. Now, it's often said that people fear public speaking more than they fear passing away, but people definitely fear passing away stronger than they do public speaking. But a study by Dwyer and Davidson in 2012 did find that the most common fear that people had was public speaking. And that idea's always fascinated me. So why do we have a fear of public speaking? What engenders this fear? Well, we are hardwired in our psychology to avoid the rejection of the group. We can handle rejection from a single person, but the rejection of the whole tribe, well, that's a little bit more existential. Because if we lose our standing in the tribe, it can mean very serious consequences. So, Mr. or Mrs. Human, you are absolutely within your rights to feel afraid of public speaking. And you're in good company. Take a letter from one of the greatest orators of all time, the Roman statesman Cicero. Personally, I'm always very nervous when I begin to speak. Every time I make a speech, I feel I am submitting to judgment, not only about my ability, but also my character and honour. I am afraid of seeming either to promise more than I can perform, which suggests complete irresponsibility, or to perform less than I can, which suggests bad faith and indifference. But just because we feel justified being afraid, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't learn to overcome that fear, because there are few greater freedoms than the feeling that you can express yourself to an audience in a confident and persuasive manner. So what are the foundations of great oration, great public speaking? Let's go back a few thousand years to the time of Aristotle, the famed philosopher, who was also the teacher of Alexander the Great. His treatise on rhetoric is widely considered to be one of the most significant works on persuasion ever written, and it forms a solid part of what we know about Greek rhetoric. Now, Greek rhetoric, it can be broken down into three principal constructs: ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos can be thought of as your credibility as a speaker, but the literal translation is character. And the Greek rhetoricians felt that this should be established from the outset. Today at speaking events, it's often the place of the MC or the master of ceremonies to introduce the speaker and give them that social proof so that the speaker doesn't have to do it themselves. But sometimes you do have to set that credibility up yourself. Now, credibility, it isn't just your expertise about what it is that you're speaking on, but it's also your virtue, how you come across. Are you endearing? Are you pleasant to listen to? Do you transmit practical wisdom about the subject? And can people relate to you as a person? And while I think it's important to set ethos in the beginning of a speech, I think ethos is also established over time, and it's changeable. You can tank your ethos halfway through if you reveal a poor personal character, or even just something odd that loses the audience in the process.
And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House! Ah!
Finally, I think ethos can be borrowed through association. You can get up there and start talking about others that had ethos that you are connected with. And ask yourself, why did Alexander the Great, in the speech that I talked about earlier, start with his father's accomplishments? Here is another example.
221 years ago, in a hall that still stands across the street, a group of men gathered and with these simple words launched America's improbable experiment in democracy.
Why does Barack Obama begin by speaking about the founding fathers when the point of the speech is to address race and racial harmony? Pathos. Pathos can be framed as appealing to or influencing the audience's emotions. Now, a great speaker will find a way to assess a shared characteristic with the audience. It might be an attitude that the audience holds. It could be a cultural characteristic of the group. Pathos can be an attempt to tap in to the hopes and dreams of the audience. And this can be accomplished through the use of emotionally charged language. It can be through storytelling. Of particular power is a personal anecdote and an expression of how you felt as a result. But in order to employ pathos to its greatest effect, we must know our audience and what appeals to them. Then we can select the most powerful tool for the job. And that's a lot easier when you're delivering a speech in person, to people you may already understand on some level. Here's an example. I lost a speech competition earlier this year to a wonderful speaker who embodied this concept of pathos in her speech, and she knew her audience. And I'm not easily moved, but I was moved by this. She delivered a speech that had an arc to it, from something that she went through that wasn't fear, which made us feel sympathy, to the effects that it had on her, to her insight and growth as a human being as a result, which made us all feel inspired, to a happy conclusion that made us feel joy for her. She knew her audience. And this goes to show that pathos doesn't have to be a manipulation. It can simply be a story that's really authentic to who you are, but can also be appreciated by the people listening to it. Logos. Logos is reasoning, logic. In Aristotle's own words, the proof or apparent proof provided by the words of the speech itself. Firstly, what are the signs that this argument might be true, and what things point to it around its periphery? Next, we can ask, what kind of inductive reasoning can we employ? What examples and observations can we use to illustrate the points of our argument? Next, it helps to think about causes and effects. If we can employ a logical cause and effect situation throughout our speech, it goes a long way to convincing people. Once we have those down, we need to think about our deductive reasoning. What conclusions are we going to draw out of our premises, of our points? Then it helps to think about analogies. Analogies are incredibly powerful for painting imagery that provides a proof as such, because this phenomena that I'm describing here also exists in this thing over here. Then we need to think about our definitions. Now, definitions are critical because if you have a precision of language that gets agreed upon, then you're not losing people when they misapprehend the meaning of what you're trying to put across. Otherwise, you get sidetracked trying to correct any misapprehensions. And all too often in our modern discourse, people argue at cross purposes because they get bogged down in the meaning of terms. Finally, cite research, science, statistics, things that have an assumed proof all of their own, which support the points that we're trying to get across. Now, while ethos, logos, and pathos are considered the primary three domains of good rhetoric, sometimes the ancient Greeks added a fourth domain, Kairos, or timeliness. Kairos, in short, is about finding the opportune moment to say something, and in the dynamics of a public forum or a speech, being able to add things in on the fly at the appropriate time can add a lot of value to what you're trying to say. But you could also think of Kairos as the structure of your speech, because it's about hitting the right notes at the right time. If you've got a killer point to make, where does it need to go? You can even think about it in terms of your energy. At what points of your speech do you want to bring the energy level up? And at what points do you want to slow it down, bring it in, be hypnotic? A man who exemplified two of these domains was Winston Churchill, a man who managed to insert himself in just about every major event in the first half of the 20th century, and a brilliant speechwriter and orator. Churchill understood perfectly the power of employing pathos, but he was also a master of timing, of Kairos. All of the content of his speeches resonated as it did because of the timeliness of the words. Let's look at a passage from his finest hour speech. If we can stand up to Hitler, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States and all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age made more sinister and perhaps more prolonged by the lights of a perverted science. That language is unmistakably used to induce a feeling in the audience. It's binary. Here's something good, something righteous, something perhaps even a little bit utopian, and then here's something dark, evil, despicable. Make your choice, audience members. What future do you want? That's what he's saying. He's driving the investment of the audience through his use of language. Another great orator was John F. Kennedy, a man who, despite having his presidency tragically cut short, guided the entire world through the most dangerous crisis that we have faced as a civilization thus far. Now, undoubtedly, besides the family prestige and social capital already providing him with wind at his back, it was his oratory skills that helped carry him to the Oval Office. In a speech in his native Massachusetts, a week before he assumed the office of presidency, he gave a masterful example of employing ethos to build credibility, and then pathos to invoke a feeling in his audience.
I have welcomed this opportunity to address this historic body, and through you, the people of Massachusetts, to whom I am so deeply indebted for a lifetime of friendship and trust. For 14 years, I have placed my confidence in the citizens of Massachusetts, and they have generously responded by placing their confidence in me. Now, on the Friday after next, I am to assume new and broader responsibilities. But I am not here to bid farewell to Massachusetts. For 43 years, whether I was in London or in Washington or in the South Pacific or elsewhere, this has been my home. And God willing, wherever I serve, this shall remain my home. It was here that my grandparents were born. It is here I hope that my grandchildren will be born. I speak neither from false provincial pride nor artful political flattery. For no man about to enter high office in this country can ever be unmindful of the contributions which this state has made to our national greatness. Its leaders have shaped our destiny long before the great republic was born. Its principles have guided our footsteps in times of crisis as well as in times of calm. Its democratic institutions, including this historic body, have served as beacon lights for other nations as well as for our sister states. For what Pericles said of the Athenians has long been true of this Commonwealth: we do not imitate, for we are a model to others.
Powerful stuff. Every person in that room hung on those words because Kennedy had illustrated that they shared together, by virtue of their identity, a grand history, a contribution to the greater whole. And with that knowledge that one of them was about to become President of the United States, they would have felt a sense of agency over the future of their nation. What about Logos, though? I had to dig a little deeper for this one, but I think this speech by President Theodore Roosevelt exemplifies the construction of reasoning within a speech, of deduction, of analogy, of drawing distinctions. This is an excerpt of a speech that he gave chastising the sensationalism in the media while accepting that they did a lot of good. Teddy had some criticisms to make about the way that they went about doing those things. To assail the great and admitted evils of our political and industrial life with such crude and sweeping generalizations as to include decent men in the general condemnation means the searing of the public conscience. There results either a general attitude either of cynical belief in and indifference to public corruption, or else a distrustful inability to discriminate between the good and the bad. Either attitude is fraught with untold damage to the country as a whole. The fool, who has not the sense to discriminate between what is good and what is bad, is well nigh as dangerous as the man who does discriminate, yet chooses the bad. There is nothing more distressing to every good patriot, to every good American, than the hard, scoffing spirit which treats the allegation of dishonesty in a public man as a cause for laughter. Such laughter is worse than the crackling of thorns under a pot, for it denotes not merely the vacant mind, but the heart in which high emotions have been choked before they could grow to fruition. And here at the end, Roosevelt is channeling a passage from the Bible, something that would have been eminently relatable to an audience 100 years ago. The crackling of serum under a sewer, like the noise of nettles under the kettles. That kind of material burns up quickly and then is gone. The original verse in the Bible compares the laughter of fools to a burning of nettles under the kettles. But here Roosevelt says that this kind of laughter that he's railing against, it's worse still because it sours the conscience of the human spirit. And so we can see here that these domains of rhetoric, ethos, pathos, logos, and kairos, all of the best speakers have employed them. And it is careful attention to ethos, pathos, logos, and kairos in speech writing and speech delivery that makes a speech great. Now, there are many other aspects to great oration that I haven't covered here, and there are many, many speeches by famous people in history to draw inspiration from. The hypnotic brilliance of MLK's impassioned "I Have a Dream" speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the virtue of Nelson Mandela on the dock of the Rivonia trial in 1964, prepared to lay down his life in the service of an equitable and fair society. Ronald Reagan, addressing the nation following the Challenger space shuttle disaster, masterfully explaining to children who had witnessed something shocking and horrific why such risks needed to be taken in the first instance. Speeches shape our history, and they shape our future. And speaking of our future, it doesn't take a genius to see that we're going to be going through some difficult times in the coming decades. That's something that we can be certain of. But we don't have to lose hope. To illustrate, I'll turn to an excerpt from one more speech, that of the writer William Faulkner, when he accepted the Nobel Prize for Literature in the early 1950s. I decline to accept the end of man. It is easy enough to say that man is immortal because he will endure, that when the last ding-dong of doom has clanged and faded from the last worthless rock hanging tideless in the last red and dying evening, that even then there will still be one more sound, that of his puny and inexhaustible voice, still talking. But I refuse to accept that. I believe that man will not merely endure, he will prevail. He is immortal not because he alone among creatures has an inexhaustible voice, but because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance. The poet, the writer's duty, is to write about these things. It is his privilege to help man endure by lifting his heart, by reminding him of the courage and honour and hope and pride and compassion and pity and sacrifice which have been the glory of his past. The poet's voice need not merely be the record of man. It can be one of the props, the pillars, to help him endure and prevail. Okay, quick postscript time. I thoroughly enjoyed making this video. I hope you got something out of it too. If you did get some value out of it, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button down below, hit the bell to be notified when I post new content. I'm not going to say that it helps out massively in the algorithm. We both know that's not true, but it will help me on my goal to reaching monetization at 1,000 subscribers. So, if you want to see more of my content, you can do that. I've also got a couple of videos up here and here for you to watch if you want to continue watching YouTube, and I highly recommend that you do. Until next time.